Hinesight.
Well, all right. Welcome to episode 2 of the Hinesight podcast, where we talk to different folks from around the industry about what I think we all agree is a system that's at very least flawed, if not completely broken, trying to find solutions to some of the challenges that face us all in the world of U.S. healthcare. So with that said, I am excited to introduce our guest number 2. All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm super excited to have our guest today, Mr. Jason Davis. I have had the honor of working with Jay in the past, and he's just got a interesting mindset. He approaches things from a different angle, and he brings some entertaining style to the way that he tackles different challenging questions. So I'm very excited. I'll let him introduce himself a bit more, but yeah, it's great to have you here, Jay. Go ahead, give us a little background on you.
Thank you, Steve. Well, Steve said it. We worked together for a long time. So it was 10 years with approximately 10 years with Global Excel. And so worked with Steve closely. I can vouch that he's a very bright fellow, very good person. And but at a certain point, I decided I wanted to try something different. So I went down the consulting route. And I had one large US client, and that was the Phia Group, and worked with them for about 6 years. And then we actually merged our interests just before the pandemic, knock on wood, and helped build their provider relations department. So all things claim repricing, negotiation, settlement, that was in my purview. Just a couple of years ago, I realized that we needed to really amplify our technology, which of course was Steve's great strength. I couldn't bring in Steve, I brought in someone else. His name's Scott Bennett, and he's a technologist, and he's been bringing in a lot of automation to our processes. And so I kind of put myself into a sales role. So I'm Chief Revenue Officer for the Phia Group. I know I'm not on all the webinars, but I work with the clients directly on our business development. And so it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Steve today and Hines.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely explore some of the different angles that Phia touches on today in our conversation. So a few different subjects, I guess. I'd like to talk a little bit about RDP. I'd like to talk a little bit about the whole IDR process and how the NSA really affected our industry, because if you think of it was a fairly smooth pond at one point, and somebody chucked this giant rock in called the ACA, and then somebody chucked another rock in there more recently. They signed it in 2020, and came into effect January 1st, 2022. So that whole No Surprises Act, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. We're about a year and 2/3 in, let's call it. What has it done? How has it changed the world? And what do you see as impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you brought it up, right? So US healthcare has been on a journey of patient protection, right? So very large, very lucrative industry. If it was its own country, US healthcare would be what, top 4, top 3? And so the unfortunate part is that consumers who don't really understand how all these things are supposed to work get caught up in a buzzsaw. And so the ACA at least stopped, lifetime annual limits, or lifetime limits rather, and really forced the payer community to pay something on out of network. So, and then there was the greatest of 3. Now, what it didn't do is it didn't say that the provider community had to accept it. It just left that, in the hands of a financial assistance program, or FAP. And that was that. So insert No Surprises Act, and really it does force both sides to try to play nice with each other and leave the consumer out of it. What has happened and since then? Well, not to mention that there was coming off a pandemic, but it's been really hard, I think, for the provider community. I think they were making potentially a lot more revenue in the out of network space. So we've seen some shrinkage on revenue cycle management companies, and even providers' own billing departments. They seem to have kind of shrunk. in that regard. In terms of the good from the human side is I think a lot less Americans are getting squashed by balance bills. Keyword is less. So I would say that while both sides are trying to metabolize the change, consumers are still getting kind of caught in the crossfire. Just less of them, thank goodness. Now, in terms of administratively, it's been a complete gong show between the lawsuits before, during, the pauses with IDR, which we're in now, which means the backlog is incurring, the raise of fees from 50 to 350 back to 50. We're really seeing a program that is being crushed under its own weight. And so the first chapter you could really call what we think we would have all expected to one end, is that it's completely messy and that it's only doing what it's intended to do at a very low percentage. So whether you want to say 50% or less, we have many years before this very complex and important function gets figured out.
So very interesting you say less, because that my experience and on a daily basis talking to different folks, balance billings are still happening. They're not supposed to be happening, but as you say, I mean, for you take any one given hospital, the size of that hospital, to implement that change within a structure that large, it's a huge change for them to absorb. Things slip through the cracks. People are still getting balance billed. Do you think it's ever going to reach its ultimate goal of stopping that?
Oh, such a good question. I'll actually send you something later, but it was a testimony by Diane Spicer, supervising attorney, community health advocates in New York. She just goes on to describe everything, that we're talking about now, which is that people in her community, 30, 40 calls a day are still getting kind of hammered. And these are not, of course, some are of low means and they're very confused. Some people are doing everything right and still getting hammered away. There's a big issue about languages. What's your first language and did you sign a consent form? So there's this whole consent form waiver. And so some folks are maybe first generation American or have just moved and their first language is in English. So they have these complicated forms, one of dozens that they're asked to sign, and they're getting hammered with some balance bills. Will we ever get there? I'm an optimist. I'm in sales, so I have to be an optimist. I do believe it. I do believe that when everyone gets up in the morning in US healthcare, especially on the provider side, that they are mission led and hurting people financially. I don't live in a world where people actually get up in the morning and want to inflict financial harm to a consumer. It's just that with all the incentives and the structures and the money flowing, people just, some of them turn a blind eye and they say, I only do this. I'm not really responsible for that. And I think we do have to kind of step up and be a little bit more open-minded to it. It's all fun and games unless it's you. And let's face it, it's not going to be you and I, Steve, because heck, we live in Canada, but besides that, it's other folks. And so I do think we'll get there because the stakes are too high. There's too much pain that happens when it's not managed well.
And for me, I mean, you talk about if your primary language is in English, even if your primary language is English, I mean, unless you've got a college degree in something legal, oftentimes those contracts are not understandable. And yeah, I agree with you on the systemic side of things. I don't think people wake up and say, I'm going to screw people over and cost them a fortune and bankrupt them with medical debt. I don't think that's the intention, but the system is designed in a way that the incentives encourage people to take actions that are harming other folks. And you and I think probably on the same side of that fight, if you will, to try to protect those individuals. And I think the whole, IDR process, the QPA, I think it's an interesting concept. I'd love to get your thoughts on, is that helping protect people? Is that helping to get to a middle ground that makes sense for folks? Or, you mentioned earlier, the backlogs, everything else, is it just creating another massive hurdle and possibly some other perverse incentives that are damaging the system?
Yeah. Sure. I do think that one step at a time. And so the first step of at least declaring that consumers should not be balance billed and having a structure. I do have front row seat. Phia touches clients from all over the country. I do have front row seats to bad actors on both sides, the payer community and the provider community, really kind of going a little hot and heavy. And I think, we work in negotiations, and there's a philosophy that says you might as well start on as far extremes as possible because you typically land somewhere in the middle. I would say that I've seen evidence of large systems and payers kind of adopting that philosophy, and that let's just stretch the extremes outward because we're going to land somewhere, whether it's 2 years, 5 years, heck, when you're talking about government interventions, we could be talking about a 10-year cycle here before we're on the other side of something that resembles organized. So again, it's helping, but no, I think chapter one is that it's messy, and you could even wonder if there's some sabotage components. Like what is it? 75% of the IDRs are from 10 organizations. Like these are not. So there's a lot of systematic clogging of the system that one could wonder about. And so I think it's helping net to the net, but we're just a percentage of what's possible in terms of the total help that it can bring to the consumer base.
Absolutely. You mentioned the start at the extremes, right? I'm going to start way down here. You're going to start way up there. Hopefully we meet somewhere in the middle. I've heard it phrased, and I believe this, that in a good negotiation, both parties lose equally. Nobody leaves truly happy. And I've read some of the results. I've seen a few of them. The result of that whole process, are they leaning more towards one side or the other, or are both parties leaving up equally unhappy?
It's hard. We feel like the pair community is doing very well overall in that process. I would say that I have seen, I agree with you. A deal both sides hates is a good deal. I haven't seen a ton of that. A lot of it is because with baseball style, it's one or the other. And so it's you either hate it or you love it because it's either one or the other, I guess, the way they have it struck up. Um, I would say that put it this way, if the question is, are the providers and payers happier? I would say that the number one headline is that the administrative staff on either side, including the government, are the losers because the dominant case study is an ineligible claim that has to get, looked at, studied, proposed, rejected, or they're ruling because someone didn't show up for the IDR, but they never filed the open negotiation in the first place. So then you have all of this work only to start at net zero because the claim was never eligible under the NSA in the first place. So the administrative bubbles on this thing is the number one headline. And if I had to give gun to my head, I'd give it a slight lean towards the pair community on because this is going to sound terrible and it's not meant to. But I think if you look at managed care history in 45 years, I would say that the table has been slanted slightly more on the provider community than on the payer side. And so if you extrapolate from that and say administratively, who has the chops to actually like lean in, know what's going on, put in the effort, systems, the dominant party sometimes can actually be the less strong in terms of managing a new process. Whereas I think regulators have targeted the payer community more. So they're more used to pivoting around the process. So I think chapter two you might see it as the provider community counterpunch. We'll see. I don't know.
In my mind, there's a kind of a system-wide trend here. If I'm let's say a large insurer, my incentive is for my premium to go up because it's the only way I can make more money. And if I'm a provider, I actually want to charge more, which forces the premium to go up, which gets me more money. So for this process to actually have a positive effect for the consumer, they have to go against the incentives of both of those parties. And it's the small, in my mind, self-funded, self-insured. They're the people that are going to gain from this. And it's the end consumer, the patient, who's going to gain from this. And I'm excited to hear you actually say that you think it's leaning slightly towards, let's call it the payer side, because that does indicate that they're trying to help the consumer. They're trying to help the self-funded, the small employer who can't afford, a 20% hike from their insurer every year.
100%. I think if I wanted to put my provider hat on, which I rarely do, let's be honest, I'm not anti-provider at all. I just rarely put on that hat. But just trying to bring balance to exactly what you said. I think what I'm reading from their side of it is, and we knew this, by hitting the out of network, especially the emergencies, if you were a provider out there who wanted to kind of play the out of network game, the game is more or less up. So then you contract back in network. But also if you were a provider system that only was contracted with because you were so deadly on the out of network side, well, now you can actually get kicked out of the network or renegotiated. So in California, when they instituted something like the No Surprises Act, they actually saw their in-network rates drop. And I think what you're hearing now is between the pandemic, which burnt out practitioners terribly, and it still is. It's bad. Every article you read is either doctor unions striking, nurses striking. The bottom line is that the provider community is saying, because we're kind of getting choked out, everyone's care is being damaged because of the out of network. Now, I think that that's a little bit of a reach, because by percentages, out of network, is much, much lower than what your in network is. But to your point, I do think the payer community benefits. I do think hopefully the consumer base will see that. But the latest reports are that premiums are rising by like 8.6%, which I think is more a reflection of inflation than the No Surprises Act, for crying out loud. But, that's kind of the narrative that I think they're championing right now, is that this ultimately hurts all of them and all of us, the consumer base, for all care.
It's fascinating that all of this is playing out on that backdrop of inflation that has gotten through the roof, because you look at the pandemic and clearly insurers had lower costs during that time. You see record profits on all the insurance side. Every article I'm reading lately, they're making money, and they're, hey, that care goes down, their premium stayed the same, and yet we see this huge premium increase this year. And the article I read recently talking about the 8.6%, that's lower than it was anticipated to be. They thought it was going to be up around 11, so they're pleasantly surprised at 8, which is good. But how much of that is just the cost of everything, the strain on trying to get qualified people to come back to work, and as you said, everyone's burned out after that pandemic, and so you're having to pay more and more on salary, throw more at benefits to get people in the door to work. So how much is this going to have an effect when the background is crazy inflation and challenges all across the employment market?
It's a perfect storm, really, when you think of it. So historically, U.S. medical inflation has always doubled regular inflation. So if anything, since the pandemic, what we've seen is, what's funny is we talk more about medical inflation since the pandemic, when as a ratio of total inflation, it's never been more balanced, even now. But it's just that last, hurting piece that's into it. But if you think about U.S. healthcare and how it's built, U.S. healthcare is the largest healthcare system in the world. So you'd think it has the most hospitals in the world, but it doesn't per capita. It doesn't. It's actually lower than the average. Well, you think it would have the highest doctors. It doesn't. It has lower than average doctors. What it does have is higher than average nurses and machinery, and of course, drug prices. The entire system is designed to generate money. So now you have pressure on the physician community and the nursing community on a money-making backdrop with inflation and a pandemic. It's the perfect storm. The No Surprises Act, if anything, it could be seen as a footnote in that narrative, because that is just crushing. So I would give the tilt in that direction in terms of what's more, heavy.
I certainly hope the No Surprises Act is going to have an impact. I think, crystal balling the future, inflation has to slow down, and I think things are going to stabilize. So hopefully when that happens, we can really see the impacts. And by then, maybe we will have figured out a bit more about how the No Surprises Act is going to work. And if the powers that be can get the system flowing the way that it was intended, maybe we'll see some results by then. Now I'm curious, in the background of all of this, probably 10, 12 years ago, RBP started to emerge. Certainly it has gained a footing. If anything, it seems to be growing, almost exponentially in the last few years. How does all of this play together? How have you seen the RBP movement, where it's going? We'll talk about all the challenges that are involved in it, but how does the whole No Surprises Act play into that? And I don't think anyone really foresaw, in my mind, I don't think anyone really foresaw how it was a footnote. It wasn't thought about, it wasn't considered, and now it's like, oh, this actually has a big impact, I believe.
Oh yeah. I mean, that is a broad question. I'll maybe piece it together, in its nearest form. So out of network management, I think that there's traditionally been two schools in out of network claim management. It's kind of been like a stack of supplemental PPOs, maybe with some smart discounts, direct negotiations, UCR, like a funnel, right? The classic, what's in your funnel? Here's our funnel, blah, 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 blah. And I think a big part of that was to try to get as many claims into a secured environment as possible, secured versus non-secured. Well, with the No Surprises Act, I think that even conservative payers are saying, well, if the emergencies are now covered under this infrastructure, then maybe it's time for me to consider a RBP model for my out-of-network management. So I do think that that's at least one micro trend there. But I'll stop there. Otherwise, I could talk about RBP and all its flavors for like the next 15 minutes. But what do you think about that kind of first initial?
I agree. That's been my kind of read on things, is that, people were very reluctant. First of all, RBP has become more mainstream, so people are hearing a lot more about it. So just that familiarity with the concept, maybe somebody across town that they're actually on an RBP plan, that has bred a comfort level with the concept. I think initially it was like a hands off. But then you bring in this dynamic of, hey, there's this new regulation that says your people can't be balance billed, at least on the emergency stuff, which, as we talked about, in practice, it maybe has reduced it, but it hasn't eliminated it. But that sentiment that's there's this protection there for my folks. Why not dip a toe into that water and test it out a little bit more? So I think that has definitely accelerated the growth, at least as I watched through the pandemic and I just listened to people talking about, what am I seeing out there? What are the interesting trends? RBP was more and more and more over the last at least 2 years, if not 3 years. Just people were willing to give it a shot.
Yeah, in terms of full RBP, what a journey that's been. And I I was lucky enough to kind of be, I kind of left one context into the Phia context early in the RBP days. So I kind of saw the front row seats, but in the early days, you had a few players, right? And most of them had a very similar structure. They accessed a physician only and then did RBP on facilities, because that's the majority of the money. And then you have, clones of that model kind of mushroom all over the place. Well, now you're definitely seeing pressure on access to the practitioner only networks out there. So the provider community have not traditionally loved RBP. Again, they were in control of the chessboard for 45 years. Why would they ever allow, that dominant position to stop? Now we're having direct to employer contracting emerge. So less pressure on accessing a network, but still there. And now the pressure is continuing down on the network side. And we're seeing, at least I'm seeing, kind of more emergence of direct primary care as trying to control that first step in the member journey, and then riffing off of that either with direct contracts or even, and trends get overstated. They always do, but like medical tourism, just going somewhere else and putting pressure, or relieving pressure from the local system and saying, hey, if you're not going to give us, a reasonable shake on our money, we're going to we're going to look elsewhere. So RBP has definitely evolved. I think you could probably say we're in the third generation. If I had to say the Wild West, right? More blue collar, 2.0, some direct contracts, more physician, and then now, really narrow, but quite evolved. RBP is not a joke. When I started, maybe 1% of our client, like if you took our whole block, so about 1% was RBP. Now, it's hard to find a TPA that doesn't have 10% just by default, and that's any TPA, whether they wanted to or not. And then the ones that truly leaned into RBP, my gosh, it could be 70% of their block is RBP, and they're all over. They're all over the place. I would say where you don't see them is in non-diverse managed care environments, and so you could just pick your place on the map. But overall, it's good. It's not a good fit for some brokers and employers. Some just don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So there's still a dominant market that just wants the old-fashioned, give me a card, give me a logo, give me, expensive peace of mind. But that's changing, I think, with inflation.
I I believe it's a good thing. If you just think about, free market dynamics, when you have a handful of very, very large players that kind of control the entire market, you need some emerging, maybe lower cost, a little bit out there idea that's going to shake up the market. And so, as much as I watched RBP in the early days and I thought this is a little insane, it's evolving and it's changing and there's better approaches and it's starting to gain some market share and it's starting to shake things up and hopefully it's going to keep things honest. Because I mentioned it earlier, if you think of the incentive, with the ACA, 20%, that's the maximum you can make in profit. So the only way you can grow is for your premium to go up. So that incentive exists and it's the wrong incentive. I think everyone kind of recognizes it now, but these guys can keep you honest. They can come in at the small end of the market. They can get those smaller employers who are hurting, who want to go self-funded, who have no other option because they can't afford the increases that are coming from the other side. And now you got to, okay, maybe my premium can't just grow infinitely. Maybe I need to actually compete against some of this lower market stuff. So I like the dynamic that it's creating, but we're not, you said third generation. I probably would agree with that. Where exactly we are on that. I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't think we're at the point where it can become mainstream. But so here's my crystal ball question for you. When do you think it does, or does it, or does do one of the big guys come in and find some defense mechanism and eliminate it? Are we at that point where we're starting to tilt into it will become mainstream, or what's your crystal ball? Try to see the future.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. It's so hard to do it because, of course, this is recorded, so you could show it to me someday at breakfast. How wrong I was. What I've learned in 20 years is that change is really slow. So if it took what it took, 10, 12 years to kind of get RBP to where it is today, I would tell you that from where I sit, I see the large players investing they're diversifying their portfolio. So they're always going to own and drive and take what works. So think of almost like a, startup embryo, embryonic environment so everything will move kind of towards the center. Like RBP, the small players overtaking the large players, I don't think that happens in my lifetime. Put it into what I see. What I do think is that over time, pieces will look the same from the current players as the large players are testing and investing what they're doing on that front. So I would say that smarter, regionalized, different settings of care that are kind of the things that RBP brought up, because instead of trying to have a network and carve everything out, they're starting blank and carving things in. So really starting with a needs-based design platform. I think those notes, 20 years, I don't think we'll differentiate between one or the other. The self-funding will continue to grow because it's just a better, more open platform, I think, for flexibility for employers. And I think that we're going to have more smart regionalized care. So, but I do think it takes 20 years because things barely get done in 10. And that's my number for NSA, even being out of the woods. So 20 years for, market retaliation / correction becoming more or less mainstream with the larger players diversifying. I think we see blended edges in 20, because it's a big system.
Yeah, it like the Titanic trying to turn, it doesn't happen fast. As much as some of us, who are energetic and want to see change and bring new things and trying out, around the fringes, hey, let's experiment with this. The reality is for that to become a mainstream answer to something, it's going to take probably 20 years, if not more, to be honest. I back to your optimistic point, I do believe that we can see some significant change in the next 5 to 10 years, but it's not going to be a mainstream. It's not going to completely change the dynamic of the market anytime soon. Interesting. I guess one of the questions I have as a consumer. So if you're the patient, it's generally not your money that goes towards choosing which plan. I mean, sure, your employer offers you maybe 2 or 3 plans to pick from, but you're not the one sitting in front of the broker looking at all the different options. And so you're kind of stuck with whatever plan you have. And if you end up with an RBP plan, my sense would be that maybe that wasn't your choice, but now you're actually kind of brought into the equation a little bit more and you become more aware of what's going on. Do you think that RBP is opening up, your average American's eyes to just how broken the system is, and that they should be making more conscious decisions around their healthcare? Or is it kind of forced on them and they're, unhappily going along with it?
I think the average American, I think they get it explained to them, and depending on the quality of the broker and the TPA, that'll be an excellent education. But imagine being told something really clearly once, and it goes against the entire template of what you understood your life to be. And maybe, you make widgets for a living. Like, I'm pretty dense. Sometimes I have to hear something multiple times before it really sinks in. I get very mindful about it. I picture myself in different situations. And I would say that the average American would still struggle with understanding. I had a card. I used to be able to go somewhere. Like, it is a totally different ballgame. In terms of what we're seeing more and more is that employers are looking at the costs. And I do think at a certain point under ERISA, you do have to take the fiduciary part seriously. And so they are looking at saying, you know what? I can't make this choice for you, but I'm going to offer you 2 options. So we're definitely seeing dual options. Now, dual options does 2 things. One is you get to explain to your employees what you've done to contain costs and that they can do it, but this is what it's going towards. So if everyone elects the more expensive option, then they can say, well, you've elected the most expensive option. This is reflected in your wages, or how I'm able to compensate you, or what incentives I have for you. Like, I think that conversation is happening, but I don't think the average, given market penetration now, I don't think they would really understand it all that well. It wasn't long ago that an average American couldn't tell you what deductible or coinsurance meant or what theirs were. That was a popular, I think it was the bitter pill that highlighted that our healthcare literacy across the board is just not high. So, who knows?
I had an interesting conversation a couple days ago, just talking to some folks, and one of the things that I realized in the conversation is your average American doesn't look at health insurance as a way to stay healthy. They look at health insurance as, when I'm sick, I just want it to work. Like, I don't care at that, because I'm not at the point where I'm thinking ahead. I'm at a point where I'm not feeling well and I just need to go in and it just needs to magically work. There shouldn't be any questions at that point. I think with RBP, with the dialogue ahead, with the education, as you mentioned, if you've got a good broker, you've got a good TPA, you've got a good plan that you're introducing, you're going to start educating and you start opening up that conversation. I think we're starting to see that. I don't know, I mean, we're talking 360 million or so individuals that need to get educated on just how broken the system is, what the options are, what it means to be proactive in your own health. But again, maybe it's my optimism. I feel like we're starting to open up a dialogue that is good for all Americans. I don't know what your take on that is.
Well, I agree. I think that, if you take two trends and move them into one, and you say, okay, the RBP trend brings the cost of healthcare home very close to home, right? And it becomes a very serious conversation. And once things are serious, people listen, right? If you're in a state of trauma, everything is focused, like everything is, you're listening. So RBP brings it home. I think the high deductible health plan thing tried to do that. But let's face it, unless you're not super affluent, but I'm saying you've got a little extra scratch at the end of the year, you have a tax planner, you're doing all the efficiencies, and you're drinking green shakes and you're running all the time. Like there's definitely a portion of the US that understands their healthcare as a kind of health optimization platform and a financial optimization situation. But the average American, that has not been their experience in terms of how to leverage those tools. So I do think that everyone's trying to come towards the center from different ends, whether you're the big dog trying to cut costs and help, or you're a smaller player trying to bring RBP into the fray. I think everyone's trying. I think the intent is there. It's just that the system's so hard to navigate. But high deductible and RBP, these are two meaningful conversations about your health, and the costs associated to it.
I mean, high deductible, from everything I'm reading, it seems to be that trend's kind of, I won't call it petering off, but definitely leveling off at very least. One of the things I saw recently was, hey, here's this high deductible plan, and then here's this other supplemental plan that you can buy up that actually covers your deductible. And I thought to myself, like, doesn't that defeat the entire purpose? I now have insurance that covers my deductible. So how much am I paying for that to be able to just pay off my deductible through another plan? And I don't know. It seems to me there's a lot of people trying to do good things, and sometimes we end up a little bit off the rails. So I guess my question to you, maybe as a closing question, because I'm conscious of time, if you had to predict where the QPA, the IDR, and the RBP trends are going to really converge and have a meaningful result, what do you think it looks like? Does that whole QPA IDR process really solve some of the challenges that RBP has been facing? And where does it end up? Is it, maybe more on the payer side, as you seem to be sensing right now, or does it balance out? Or, give me your prediction on how those two trends come together.
Yeah, I'll keep it really simple. Any conversation towards payment, reimbursement, and anything that is away from bill charges is a significant step towards a conversation of changing the entire foundation of reimbursement, right? And I think that can only help all transactions. I've spent more of my career than I care to talking about charges and how ridiculous they are, and talking to providers about their charges, and how providers said no one cares about our charges because no one pays them. Well, I've been on the front row where, yes, they are weaponized, their charges, and they have been tough to manage. So I think that we're seeing it's diluting the charges in the conversation generally, which I think all RBP would say, I want a reference for what I pay, and it ain't your charges, bro. And so I think that helps in terms of the out of network. I think if it's going to take 10 years to dismantle just the 5 to 10% of claims that are out of network on a mainstream plan, then you can extrapolate from there. But I do think it does bring the idea that there is a reasonable amount that healthcare costs, and there's a reasonable amount of visibility on how that should go based on quality. So that's really the convergence point. But I told 20 years for some of these trends. I'll stick to that. But I do love that we're no longer having a conversation that starts with the ghost in the room that is the charges. That I think that is definitely waning, and it'll have a more grounding effect, I think, to transactions in healthcare, and that can only be good. It's the only industry that starts with an MSRP that's just in some other stratosphere.
Totally fictitious. Yeah. Fantastic point. I think both trends are on that exact point, that charges are not even a remotely reasonable approximation of what is a fair payment. And yes, on occasion, people get caught in the fray and charges are brought up, and that's what you're supposed to be paying is the full bill charge. But I think we all recognize that they're ridiculous, and perhaps these two trends are coming together to finally change that dynamic a little bit. Jason, listen, it was great catching up with you. Always love to have the conversation. I'd like to give you an opportunity, maybe talk a little bit about what Phia does and just kind of give a plug for all the great things that organization brings to the market. I think most of our listeners are somewhat familiar, but why don't you give a little overview if you wouldn't mind?
So really short, folks, 10 seconds or less. The Phia Group, we're a mission-led company. We really believe in lowering the cost of healthcare. It's just too expensive, and the average American is getting hurt by it. We offer subrogation recovery services, consulting and compliance services, and provider relations services when it comes to dealing with claims. Very much like what we talked about today. So there you go. Kept it light. If you want to hear more, hit me up on LinkedIn or email, and I'd love to talk to anybody.
Awesome. We'll throw your contact details at the bottom of the screen here. And thank you, Jay, and thank you everybody for listening in today.
Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate you having me, man.
Hinesight.